Today I'm going to talk about how the different settings on your camera work together, because we already talked about the definitions of them in an earlier taping, and this time we want to tell you how all of these interrelate to one another. And it's very important for you to be able to understand that these terms interrelate so closely that they're just knit like a fine glove together. If we have shutter speed and aperture, remember the aperture was how big or how closed down the shutter gets, and the shutter speed is how fast that goes. Those relate together. So if you can think of it working as a well-tuned object together, if we have an aperture of, let's say, 3.5, and you'll see this on your cameras. This may be a little foreign to some of you, but I think as you look at this over and over, you're probably going to understand it better. 3.5 aperture means that it is wide open. In other words, remember we have the aperture here, and we're going to have it look like this. Remember I drew that shutter. 3.5 means this opening right here, this dark opening, is open further, letting more light come in. As we go higher in numbers, and we go to, let's put an F here because that's how they do this, F16, that means if we were to look at that shutter, this is what it's going to look like. Shutter is the aperture is very, very small. And so it doesn't let as much light in. Now let's just imagine that the light source coming into both of these is exactly the same. If it's exactly the same, this is going to give us a way higher exposure, or brighter exposure on our image. This is going to make it a little bit darker. But let's say, for instance, that it's a bright sunny day. You know, one of those that you're squinting and you got to wear something over your eyes to shield your eyes, like a hat or a visor. Then we want to go to something like this, F16, rather than this. This is more for low light situations. And this is for strong light, or for lack of better words, or bright. Okay, so this is what's going to happen. Now, the neat thing about the cameras are, when you have an aperture priority, which is the AV on these cameras, if you have an aperture priority, you can set anything in between here what you want to do. So if you have a real low light condition, you might want to open that wide up. Now what's going to happen when you set those to wide open and the light is the same? It means the shutter speed now. Let's talk about shutter speed. We want the same amount of light exposing our sensor, or if you want to call it film, it really isn't film, but the sensor. You want the same amount of light exposing from this light source, and if you have this wide open, that means the shutter better open and close really quick because it doesn't want to let much light in. Now if you have it stop, you've heard the expression maybe from people, stop down. This means stop down, closed up in other words. And the light comes in to that, and you want to get it a certain amount, then it has to stay open a little longer. So it's going to have a slower shutter speed. A slower shutter speed, and this one will have a much higher. Sounds a little backwards, doesn't it? But you just got to think about it. If you want the same amount of light to come in and the hole is really big, it needs to open and shut really fast. If the hole is really small, you need to have that hole stay open a little longer to allow enough light in to expose your sensor, or your negative or film or whatever you might be using at that particular time. I think it's important for you to understand where we use these different aperture settings. How does that relate to our photography? It all ties in. Remember when we said depth of field before? We were talking about depth of field. And remember, that's the distance between point A to point, excuse me, I better put my hand in front, point A to point B. And everything in between those 2 points are in focal range. In other words, they're in focus. If you were to take a look on a regular camera lens, there are numbers on the top of the lens, and there'll be little brackets, and it'll show how big the depth of field is in feet or meters, how far that'll be at a particular setting. Typically, the higher the f-stop, the bigger the depth of field, or the longer, the deeper, however you want to describe it, the longer the depth of field. So, if I wanted to take a picture of a scenic picture, and I wanted everything in focus, or I was doing a large group of people at a family reunion, and I wanted the people in the front row in focus and the people in the back row in focus, I need to set the camera around f16 or f22, somewhere in there. Now, if you have a little point and shoot camera like this, it probably won't go as high as this. It might only go to f10, f8. So keep that in mind, that it might not go quite as big as what some, the bigger, more professional cameras will do. You just have to take a look and see where it's at on there. So you're going to want to set it high. But then what does that mean? If it's a cloudy day outside and you're doing a family reunion, all of a sudden, oh golly sakes, I set it at this, that means my shutter speed really has to be slow. Now anything below a 1/30th of a second, which means a half a second, you can't hand hold it very well. You need a tripod. So keep that in mind. Shutter speeds come in numbers also. So you're going to have a lot of numbers bombarding you when you're working with this. Let's just backtrack here a little bit on shutter speed, on the numbers, before you get totally confused. You have things normally from 1/30th of a second on up to, oh man, you may have a 500th of a second. And 1/500th of a second is not very long, is it? That means it's really a bright condition and that shutter can't stay open very long, so it's going really fast. A 1/30th of a second is going to let more light in. Now, there's so much to tell you, it's almost like I don't know where to pick a place and start. Let's say, for instance, you're doing a picture of a waterfalls or a stream. We see these a lot. You're out hiking and you see a stream, and the water's rippling over it and it's really pretty. And you say, gee, I really want to stop the action on that stream and I want to see that water. Well, then you're going to move it up to a higher shutter speed to stop the action. So the higher this goes, you stop action. And this also plays into place when your kids are on the football field or doing a soccer field and you want to photograph them in the middle of a kick. You've got to stop that action. Now, if you want that leg blurred, then you're going to go in the opposite direction and let it blur. So, if we were looking at a stream, and I know you've seen pictures where the stream looks this real milky, frosty look. How the photographer gets that is sets the shutter speed down slower. He may even go slower than this. He may go down to 1 or 2 seconds on the camera with a tripod now mounted, the camera on the tripod. He may go down to 1 to 2 seconds, let that be open a long time, and what that does is blurs any motion or action that's going to go. So keep that in mind, that depending upon what you want to do with the image is where you're going to set that shutter speed. So don't get these two mixed up, but they all are numbers, and it's just a matter of sitting down and thinking it through. In the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about how all of these interrelate. So please go online and check that part out.